because in large organizations, that's an inducement to stay and not go anywhere, because then you don't have to get drug tested. Because the reality is most companies don't drug test but once, and that's it. So I do my drug test and I'm set for however long.
What's truly amazing is, as Barbara mentioned, and as I see when I go to the bank in DC to make a deposit, there'll be like 35 windows, only 2 tellers, 50 of us in line, and there's a big huge sign saying you can feel good about banking at First Union because this is a drug-free workplace. But as Robert indicates, when you take that test one time and they declare it to be a drug-free workplace, when the employees could be stoned out of their minds on many other types of drugs, they could be high on drugs that are not detected, certainly like alcohol, and so the idea that this is a drug-free workplace is patently absurd.
I was made aware last night about there's THC and then there's THCV, tetrahydrocannabivarinol. It's an added chemical that a lot of people don't even know is active in some marijuana that is grown above 12,000 feet or when it does a certain flowering. From my understanding, the government is going to tap on that V onto the pharmaceutical grade marijuana, so you cannot be tested and say that it was pharmaceutical grade marijuana when you are tested.
Well, I've heard similar rumors, if you will, and there are definitely efforts underway, which we'll go into much greater detail in other panels today, about how the government is trying to come up with tests that can discern the difference between metabolites generated from whole smoke cannabis and that from either marinol or hemp seed oil. So, two last questions, gentlemen.
I actually have a comment that might be of interest to some of you. I found at least 20 years ago, when the job was dangerous and dirty enough, you could smoke marijuana on it with perfect impunity. I was loading cable in the hole at Simplex in Newington, and occasionally the foreman would say, "Hey, stop smoking that shit down there." And we'd say, "Why don't you fucking come down and try it?"
What your opinion was when a hospital does do drug testing on a woman in labor without their consent, who practices herbalism and midwifery, and what your opinion is on the hospital stealing the urine to do a drug test.
Is this what occurred in your case?
Yes.
You know what I would say. No, I just think that that's a horrifying story, and I don't know enough about it to comment, but it's not clear to me in any medical sense that having ingested marijuana at some point in the past is going to affect the outcome of childbirth. So why would that be indicated? Especially, why do any additional procedures when somebody is in labor? You know, that's not the time to be messing around with more poking and stuff like that.
No.
So it's just, part of the insanity.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, Bob, what's up?
Yes.
76. The public was just astonished. And there was a man sitting nearby watching all of this. A man just sitting at the table, a customer of the pub. He walked over and said, "Here, try this." So, held his light, swung around, pinged the glass, took a sip and said, "My God, man, this is urine." And the guy says, "Yeah, but whose?" From the earliest days of the urine testing battle, we discovered two things that many people opposed to the testing, as we were. Other people who were opposed to testing for political reasons, looked to the testing to be flawed on a technical basis. That, the tests were no good, there was a high rate of false positives and false negatives, people would cheat, people would not cheat, etc., etc. It seemed to me early on that those arguments were going to be fairly fruitless, although I certainly participated in all of them, and when found out a study that showed the testing was not as great as the testers complained. I pointed that out. But I thought that also we were going to lose on those grounds. We were going to lose in the courts because the reality is that a significant amount of technological effort was spent on the testing itself. In fact, I say often, and I'm happy to say to you, that if you are subjected to a test of your urine to find out if there's cannabinoid metabolite or morphine metabolite, et cetera, it's probably better testing than the testing that you get at the laboratory to find out what your cholesterol or your blood count are. So it's testing that's been more thoroughly evaluated, and the laboratories who do testing for the federal government are held to a very high standard. That is, the high standard is whether they can identify these 5 compounds or not. So in almost all court hearings in recent years, the issue of the technical expertise of the drug testing industry is not even subject to question. There are certain exceptions to that. New York State still engages in unconfirmed testing of all people in prisons. That is, they just get the first so-called screening test and there's never any confirmation, and the courts have refused to overturn that. And clinical testing of women, the question was put to Barbara Ehrenreich during her last talk. Women who come to hospitals, particularly not the hospital where they receive care, and are subject to going into labor somewhat hurriedly, they're often subjected to unconfirmed urine testing. That is, they have the first level test, the screening test, and then what's supposed to happen in the workplace in general is that you get a second test, a confirmation test. But under the guise of clinical intervention, often the testing for women in labor is quite inadequate and not subject to confirmation. And courts, by and large, I've participated in about 3 cases in New York in which a woman subjected to this and having told that she had drugs in her urine and the test was never confirmed, and in most instances an antihistamine will cause a false positive on a screening test for, interestingly enough, methadone. Usually that's eliminated in the confirmation testing, but in this kind of setting, not only is the testing permitted, but the city and the hospitals are not punished for having subjected the woman to holding her child back, refusing to let her leave the hospital, even threatening her for custodial rights, on the basis of, well, of course, it's for the good of the children. And I think that's another point we have to focus on, is that the great world out there still regards the testing as somehow something that does good. It protects us somehow, in particular in terms of the workplace. It sanitizes the workplace so that things are better, that there's less absenteeism, there's less accident generation, there is more productivity. Dan Quayle used to be fond of standing up and saying that one of the reasons we'd fallen behind in the industrial race to Japan was because drug use was so rampant in the American workplace that our workers were less productive. So early on, Lynn and I and a number of other people began to talk about a different kind of gap in the science and technology of urine testing, which was simply the testing to show that it did any damn good at all. And I should have realized right away that, again, oftentimes my political naivete in retrospect astonishes me. I thought that many of the men and women who were working in the drug testing field had perfectly good scientific reputations, and that they too would understand that the critical issue here is to do outcome studies, to take a workplace or a group of workers, generate a control group, find out where the drug users were, follow them forward in comparison to non-drug users, and find out if indeed elimination of drug users would take bad workers out of the workplace, or that testing for cause would lower the accident rate. And what I discovered was there were 2 responses. Usually, well, those studies have already been done, and I'll say a little bit about that. And the second was a sort of vagueness, which is we don't have to do those studies. We don't have to do outcome studies because basically we know that drug users are bad workers, that they have higher accident rates, they give us more unemployment, they terminate earlier, they produce shoddy widgets, And furthermore, as we heard